Hello, everyone. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the continuation of our wonderful climate change conference. My name is Suzanne Wofford, and the heavy lights just came on. Wow, okay. My name is Suzanne Wofford, and I am the Dean of the Gallatin School, which is hosting this fantastic conference. We had a wonderful opening last night from Naomi Oreskes. Many of you may have been there. And we have a wonderful set of fantastic panels during the day today. And I just want to call your attention to the fact that not only is the program on this little blue sheet program, but those of you who registered have it on your phone. And if our planners had had their wish, there would have been no paper program. But so those of you who have it, who have the link, you can follow the program there. I'd like to ask Peter, Bella, and Anne. Where are you, Anne? Are you here?
Yeah, I'm here.
If you guys would just stand up for a second. I just want to thank you. These are the three organizers. Peter Oscar, Bella Mirabelle, and Anne DeWitt. We came up with the idea over a year ago and have led us into taking this climate change as a year-long school initiative. I also want to thank the many people who've agreed to speak and participate, and to Rachel Plutzer, Teresa Anderson, Jen Burge, and the theater crew for working with us in so many ways to make this a wonderful event in the experience of it, including the wonderful coffee break outside, which will still be there at 11 when we have our coffee break. And Keith Miller, who is the curator of the art exhibit that you see over there. For those who can, there'll be an opening on Monday, which will be a reception on Monday. It's already open, which will include a ecological environmentalist dance from Kathy Posen, who's one of our choreography teachers at Gallatin. So this is an art exhibit to think about climate change, and please enjoy it during the breaks and come back later. I think it's up for about a month. I wanted also to say, just a word very briefly, in the small chance that some of you aren't aware of this, that Gallatin is a small interdisciplinary liberal arts college that's nestled inside of NYU. We have about 1,500 undergraduates, and we have about 200 master's students. And these students all shape their own course of study with a faculty advisor who helps them to define an area of concentration. So we are an interdisciplinary school. We have no departments, and the faculty work together in ways that you'll see some examples of today, including some colleagues from other parts of NYU. So the idea of the conference, as you see from the program, is really one that has to do with having us as a community communicate about this very important issue. I should mention that there is a lunch break, and I think very particularly I should encourage you to pay attention to the fact that at the end of the day, we're having a very special theatrical event. So if you take a look at your program, I hope everybody will have the stamina to be here for the culmination of the program. I just wanted to say very, very briefly that the moment we planned the climate change conference, obviously climate change has been a concern since the 60s, 70s, 80s. It's not a new thing, so there was no reason to doubt that it would be an important topic. However, things have happened in the years since the planning started to make it particularly intense. And I was particularly overwhelmed in late August when there was an article in the Times that said, these are the things that Trump has undone during his presidency. And then it goes through the different areas, including a list of about 20 things that rules, regulations in the environmental arena that have been canceled since the time that he's been president. So some of the things that maybe his most lasting legacy is his capacity to affect these administrative units that control so much of what goes on in the United States. So I just thought I would mention very briefly, he withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. He blocked the Clean Power Plan. He ended a study on the health effects of mountaintop removal mining, otherwise known as strip mining. He rescinded a rule for mandating that rising sea levels might be considered when building public infrastructure in flood-prone areas. He reversed an Obama ban on drilling for oil in the Arctic. He withdrew a rule regulating fracking on public land. He rejected a proposed ban on the pesticide chlorpyrifos. This is the one that has been sickening the farm workers from exposure to that chemical. He reversed the ban on plastic bottles at national parks. He repealed a ban on lead bullets. He rescinded a limit on the number of sea animals that can be trapped or killed in fishing nets. He delayed and potentially rolled back the automotive fuel efficiency standards. He repealed the Waters of the United States rule that expanded the definition of water bodies that were protected by the EPA, ended a rule banning dumping waste from mining into streams, reversed a rule banning hunting bears and wolves. And I just have to say, I didn't even include all of the things that were in this Times article. So it is an intense moment when someone who is opposed to and focused on ending the EPA and undoing it is in fact in charge of it. So I'm very happy that we have an opportunity for some serious thought about how our university and ourselves and our political world, how we can have an impact on these sets of issues. So thank you again to all the various people who participated. And I'm passing the baton to Valerie Polonais, the Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs and Associate Professor at Gallatin, who will be chairing the panel.
All right. Morning, everyone. Thank you, Dean Wofford. Again, my name is Valerie Polonais, Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs. Welcome to all of you and to our first panel, Climate Change Across Borders, Global Effects. Wonderful faculty panel for you today. I'm not sure if everyone has a schedule in front of you. Unfortunately, Professor Rosalind Fredericks couldn't be here today. She was going to speak on global detritus of the climate change from the Dakar garbage dump. Unfortunately, she's not here. We will start go down in order with Professor Rudy Lukos, Associate Professor here at Gallatin, taking through the global and climate change, then on to Professor Jacob Reams, disaster, solidarity, and a little bit of optimism. Then on to Alejandro Velasco, who is on Skype, Latin America Neo-Extractivist Paradox, Professor Jerome Whittington, who's at the Department of Anthropology, Can Climate Change Activism Act Up? Science, American Recalcitrance and Global Implications. And then Alison Hesler, who was a former fellow here at Gallatin, who's come back. Welcome back. International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, Climate Change, Migration, and Cultural Preservation. We'll talk for about 8 to 9 minutes or so, and we'll start with President. You can, wherever you feel most comfortable. No.
Good morning.
Morning.
So I want to thank everyone that put this wonderful event together. So I'm one of the people on this panel who does not work on climate change. And it's not the central preoccupation of my research. So as I prepared for this panel, not exactly sure why I was here, when I'm in situations like this, I begin to obsess about the titles of the things that I'm asked to speak about. So I started obsessing about the title of the panel, Climate Change Across Borders, Global Effects. Climate change by definition crosses borders and by definition is global in the most literal sense possible. It's planetary. So what are we trying to get at when we say climate change across borders, global effects? Why not just say climate change and leave it at that? The term climate change implies a transborder phenomenon that has a huge global effect. Obviously, the title of the panel suggests that while scientists name something called climate change, they are certainly naming a planetary condition that is a global condition, but that does not exhaust the senses in which something called climate change crosses borders. There is not one global effect, there are many global effects. As an anthropologist of globalization, who came of age right when globalization as a term was emerging in the early 1990s, which is the work that I've done in the context of India, I'm struck by some of the ways in which climate change now mirrors the trajectory of a term like globalization. In his important essay, The Climate of History, 4 theses, much discussed, debated, and so on, Deepesh Chakrabarty notes how highly explicit and focused discussions about climate change emerged in the late 1980s and early 1990s at precisely the time that globalization emerged as an object in the social sciences and humanities. But it was not until much later in the 2000s that climate change displaces, in some sense, globalization as a kind of meta-concept within a meta-narrative that begins to organize fields, imagination, discussion, discourse, etc. Right? Now, the shift from globalization to climate change, I think, is an interesting one, and there are many debates about how to conceptualize climate change. You use the term Anthropocene. If you want to link it to globalization, and you thought globalization would equal global capitalism, then should we call it something else, etc., etc. I would like to wonder about whether and how some of the conceptual and methodological tools of an anthropology of globalization enables or perhaps is challenged by a reckoning with the phenomena of climate change. As a way to name our contemporary moment, the term globalization entered popular media and advertising in the early 1990s. After the fall, this is a quick and dirty, that's your remarking, right? After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the breakup of the Soviet Union, enthusiasm accelerated for increasing international trade, deregulating national economies, privatizing the state, structurally adjusting developing world economies, all of which happened before 1989, but we like these neat markers, and increasing the transnationalization of corporations. Globalization was the new term that signaled the triumph of a capitalist market. As social science became increasingly focused on globalization, theories of globalization emphasized the transformations in labor, capital, state, and technology that have created a heightened sense of global interconnection. So globalization entered anthropology, as it did many disciplines, as a specific object of methodological and theoretical reflection, and began to dominate the horizons of a wide variety of scholarship. Anthropological attempts to grapple with globalization were crucial for reworking the anthropological concept of culture and reconfiguring ethnographic methodology. In so doing, the anthropology of globalization expanded and nuanced dominant theories of globalization while raising questions about its effect, scope, and reach. So my presentation today is just wondering about what that sort of shift does when one confronts climate change. Now, dominant theories of globalization are more often than not macro-sociological, emphasizing large-scale perspectives on economic, political, and cultural transformations that are understood to either fuel or be effects of globalization. Could there be anything larger and more macro than climate change? One of the key contributions of the anthropology of globalization has been to emphasize the interaction between what was called the local and the global, emphasizing the interplay between large-scale global transformations and the realities of long-standing social and cultural worlds. And attention to this interplay has led to a focus on mapping and naming the large-scale shifts in culture and political economy that constitute globalization, but also a focus on people's everyday lived experiences and their transformations under conditions of globalization. While the local global framework of analysis shifted the macro-horizontal view of dominant theories of globalization, it also contributed to rethinking the conventional scales of ethnographic analysis. Whereas the anthropology of globalization emphasized the local in the face of assertions about the dominance and power of large global processes, within the discipline itself, contextualizing the local and the global was a key way anthropology began to shift its own frameworks for understanding the productions of culture and meaning within the contemporary world. This has led to new ways of thinking about ethnography beyond a focus on the purely place-based local context, ones that emphasize multi-sided ethnography across social scales, ethnographies of networks, assemblages, among others. And there are people who do this on this panel. This attention to the local-global interface that shapes experiences of globalization was an attempt to work against a monolithic view of globalization as a force that was simply homogenizing the world into some vision of America in some unproblematic way. As it turned out, the attention anthropologists paid to productions of difference within contexts of localization, the complex productions of locality within a global world, go a long way toward helping us understand why, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, if you want to use that marker as important for a certain triumphalist understanding of globalization. Oh my God, okay. The globe did not turn into one giant Disneyland. Resistance, reaction, fracturing, violence, and heterogeneity mark the experiences of globalization. Is this true of climate change? It might be somewhat self-evident what the global of climate change is, but what is the local of climate change? What is the local global interface of climate change? How could we argue that climate change is not some self-evident process that is homogenizing the world, when it seems to do precisely that, a homogenization into a catastrophe that envelops us all? The ways anthropology has thought the local global, I think, forces us to recognize that while climate change is a radical force reshaping the world, if we are to confront it, we ignore the local in the global and the global in the local to our peril. If there is a way out of the catastrophe we are in, and I'm not sure there is, it is in and through multiple local global articulations around the world, not through some monolithic narrative that can encompass us all. It did not happen with globalization. That's very clear, this many decades later. I don't think it will happen with climate change. Around the conceptualization of local global has been, while that's been instrumental, I think anthropology did suffer from romanticizing the local, and seeing the local as a kind of space of authentic resistance. A key challenge for the anthropology of globalization is maintaining its assumptions about the global as a space of homogeneity, because power homogenizes, while arguing against its homogeneity to locating particularity and difference across scale. Contemporary work in the anthropology of globalization is complicating our sense of what constitutes the global, emphasizing the productions of locality within global capitalism, and demonstrating the ways that the global itself is not some abstract set of large-scale social processes. Instead, it has its own peculiarities that can be tracked and named. And it's here that I think an anthropology of globalization enables some reckoning with the complex phenomena of climate change as it crosses borders and produces multiple effects. While we may not be able to fully grasp climate change as universality or horizon, climate change is in the world, doing work across scales, networks, assemblages, localities, shaping experience, being ideologically debated in much the same way that globalization was. Okay, I'm going to sort of skip the whole thing and wrap up a little bit. So one of the things that I'm skipping a little bit is, quite apart from local global, the other aspect of the anthropology of globalization is obviously emphasizing the cultural dimensions of globalization as opposed to the economic and the political, which were dominant when anthropology began to engage this question. And so I think one of the ways in which the anthropology of globalization impacted the discipline was to create a more fluid, dynamic sense of cultural production across scale, in relationship to things like politics and culture, politics and economy, but paying attention to that notion of the cultural. So how does this anthropological insistence on pluralism, varied cultural context, and dynamism sit alongside the notion that humans have now become a geological force in ways that must force us to think about ourselves less as multiple human communities shaping and adapting to our plural environments, and rather a species with a radically different understanding of the relationship between the human and the non-human? Are there cultures of climate change? Are there cultures in climate change? This is the question that has fueled a lot of generative work on new forms of materialism that have shaped the human-non-human interaction, reconceptualizing the ways that anthropology thinks about the dividing line between human and nature. But what is the nature of difference within these evolving reconfigurations of the human? What happens to concepts like race and gender when we think of humans as species? And I think that sort of persistent question that anthropology asks about locality and difference might sort of help anthropology move into some new areas. So just one more thing. Okay. So one of the, I want to wrap up with an aspect of the debate about globalization that was very, I think, generative and formative, which is what one might call the abjection of globalization. The idea of not just the production of difference, but increasing levels of exploitation and vulnerability. The whole, is globalization good, is globalization bad, right? Is it alleviating global poverty? Is it exacerbating global poverty? Anthropology has emphasized both the cultural resilience and creativity of local populations under conditions of globalization, while recognizing new levels of exploitation and vulnerability. Some seek to track in multiple ways structures of expanding opportunity or greater exploitation, and some feel that globalization is an altered terrain of struggle that shapes these experiences of exploitation. And it may be where we are, in an altered terrain of struggle and hope and despair, in which multiple social and cultural worlds, unevenly situated both in a global and planetary sense, must navigate climate change as object in the world, political tool, economic opportunity, cultural object, and as a horizon we can only approach. It is in that space between object and horizon that we experience, in highly varied and differentiated ways, our collective sense of catastrophe.
Very much, Ruth.
Hi there, thanks. Hi there, thanks for coming, and thanks to the organizers for putting this together. I'm really excited to hear the way other people's work here sort of touches on some of these corners of globalization. I was listening too carefully, of climate change. So I'm going to start in 1919, when a former Anglican priest from Eastern Canada, who was going blind and retired from the clergy and became a novelist, came out with a book called The City of Comrades. It is a terrible book. It was called by a reviewer ponderously didactic was the other part. I can't remember the first one. Is a not very good book about a Montreal-born architect who moves to New York, becomes a heavy drinker, falls out of favor, ends up breaking into houses in order to pay for his dipsomania, but then is rescued by fellow derelicts who, coming together in a city of comrades, help him out of his abjection. We're also with the help of a love interest who also happens to be the person whose house he broke into. Anyway, it's a terrible book. But this title, City of Comrades, is really telling. It comes out in, so 1919, it was about a year and a half after the Halifax explosion, which was arguably the largest man-made explosion before the atomic bomb. Killed about 2,000 people when a munitions ship bound for the front of World War I collided with another ship and exploded in Halifax Harbor in Nova Scotia. It killed about 2,000 people, made about 25,000 people homeless or jobless. This phrase, City of Comrades, as far as I can tell, first appears in print related to Halifax, because what happens in Halifax is, according to another Anglican priest who was there, who also happened to be a sociology graduate student at Columbia at the time and wrote his dissertation on it, Halifax became a city of comrades in which people helped each other across class and social lines. Intriguingly, Basil King, the author of the novel, worked under contract to Samuel Goldwyn. So the books that Goldwyn wanted to adapt into movies automatically sort of became movies. And so there was a movie adaptation of City of Comrades. As far as I know, no print of this movie exists, but contemporary press accounts relate how, unlike in the book, which all takes place in New York, in the movie, the architect is revived when he regains himself, joins the army, ends up in Halifax at the time of the explosion. And the explosion becomes a crucial moment in his redemption, partially because his love interest then nurses him back to health after he is injured in the explosion. So why am I starting my comments with this obviously very non-climate related disaster? There is more to climate change than disaster, and there is more to disaster than climate change. But it is unquestionable that we are going to see more disasters. Hurricanes are the disaster that we think of most often when we think about climate change. In fact, I think the science is kind of still a little bit unclear about the relationship between hurricanes and climate change. But what seems to be the case is that a greater proportion of storms will be stronger storms. Although it is not actually clear that there will be more storms. It's a little bit unclear. But in some ways, what is more important than the hurricanes are the less cinematic disasters. The droughts, the heat waves, the flash flooding, because one thing we know is happening with climate change is that a greater proportion of precipitation comes in extreme precipitation events. So more of our rain now in New York is coming at moments in which there's a lot of rain rather than spread out more. This causes flash flooding, this causes obvious problems for infrastructure and society. And we are made more vulnerable to the climate, to these sorts of disasters by the chronic effects of climate change. Things like higher sea levels and erosion, which then make these extreme weather events more dangerous to us. That also actually makes us more susceptible to non-climate related disasters, like say tsunamis, which also because of climate change or because of rising sea level and erosion have greater effects. In some ways, I think that the iconic climate change disasters that we should think of is not a hurricane, but is the monsoon season that South Asia has been suffering through in the last month or two. As Raghad Karnad put it in the Guardian a couple of weeks ago, flood in drought season. So simultaneously disastrous flooding, a particularly strong monsoon season, at the same time that elsewhere there are droughts. This seems grim. I intend and I acknowledge that this is grim. This is particularly grim, I think, when we think about Irma and Harvey. But I did promise in my title, I promised hope. So I'm going to back up a little bit and tell you something about the history of disaster studies, which by some accounts starts with the Halifax explosion, starts with that priest I was telling you about who was a sociology graduate student at Columbia. But it also, in other ways, starts in a very urban context of engineers and early urban planners trying to make cities less susceptible to fires. And they really actually did mostly solve fires. Industrial cities in North America burned at an incredible rate. We can think about Chicago, Boston, Baltimore, Toronto, Jacksonville, Salem, I can't remember if I say Chicago, all in a 35-year span at the end of the early 20th century. But Salem in 1914 was one of the last because changes in the way cities were built really did tame those urban conflagrations. And then a subsequent generation of disaster scholars coming from sociology largely, and funded by the US government in preparation for fear of nuclear attack, focused on, rather than on building, rather than on technological solutions and engineering solutions, focused on society. The thing that we can, the major lesson of many that we can think of as the catchphrase for that generation of disaster scholars is that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. That disasters are always the intersection of society, the way we choose to shape our societies, and some hazard, natural or not. But if that came from the Cold War, there's now a new generation of disaster scholars, of whom I am one, who are inspired or at least driven by climate change and the disasters that come from climate change. My own work sort of falls out of Katrina. So what might my generation of disaster scholars bring out in this third wave? And I hope that led by people like Rebecca Solnit, we might start seeing solidarity as a crucial thing that we are going to think about and study in disasters and disasters of climate change. Disasters are moments of solidarity, big and small. We can think of friends and neighbors helping each other immediately after the disaster, even before the disaster, helping to prepare, helping people dig out. The true first responders are always neighbors. They're always civilians and local people who go and help each other. We can think also about big, new adventures in urban citizenship. In Katrina, we see Common Ground, which was a group founded by anarchists and Black Panther veterans to help each other in mutual aid, first in mutual defense from vigilantes, and then in first aid, and then in home rebuilding, in a very self-consciously radically left model of solidarity, not charity. We can also think in this city about Occupy Sandy, which again was focused very strongly on neighbors helping neighbors, and in not only enacting these ties of solidarity, but building these ties of solidarity. All right. I'm going to skip what I was going to say about building stronger cities, more resilient cities, and more resilient communities, not just because the most resilient cities to climate change and to disaster are also the cities and the communities that we want to live in ordinarily. I'm going to say a lot of that, but I'm not going to. But what I will say just in closing is that one of the things that new communication technologies and the global reach of climate change is, I hope, what can provoke in us, and that I think we need to consciously start building, is a global city of comrades, is building global solidarity, so both to prevent and mitigate and adapt, or prevent and adapt to climate change, but also then mitigate its response, and to respond to each other around the world, not in violence, certainly, not even in charity, but in solidarity.
I'm going to speak on over.
Can you hear us?
There he is. Hi, Alejandro. You're on.
Can you hear us?
Not yet.
I could have kept talking.
We can't hear you, Alejandro. Can you hear us?
Hello.
Did you have him on before?
Can you hear us?
Say again, Jen.
Massachusetts, right? Cameron, she's an analyst.
All right. Would someone email Alejandro, or just tell him to go to the next person? We'll try to figure this out. All right.
Does Jen have it up on the booth?
Jerome?
One second.
I'll give you 1 second.
They had it on the beginning.
Yeah. One more second.
Yeah. Is my PowerPoint?
All right, we have Jerome Jensen. Can climate change activism act up? Science, American recalcitrance, and global implications.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
The infallibility of technology and the wisdom of humanity, I'm sure we'll say. Is it connected?
VGA?
So I'm an anthropologist of science and technology and the environment. I work in Southeast Asia. I study decarbonization, technology, and cultures around decarbonization. What I want to talk to you today, though, is different. I want to talk about American science and the activism around climate science in the U.S., especially over the past 8 or 9 or 10 months. It's really a semi-casual reflection on U.S. climate rhetoric's meager politics of authoritative science. In contrast, I want to make a contrast here to the visceral and powerful affirmation of anti-AIDS activism. When it comes to climate change, we increasingly understand that the active suppression of science is a social justice issue. Naomi Oreskes' very important and seminal work has shown the direct connections between climate denialism and the corporate denial of the medical link between smoking and cancer. Debates about environmental problems, especially as they affect marginalized groups, have long circled around the legitimacy and integrity of environmental sciences. The simple ability to enforce environmental laws requires being able to prove environmental harm in a courtroom, and that requires solid research and evidence. But as science institutions are valorized and its institutional authority is reconfirmed in public debates, I also want to connect American climate politics to a more troubling genealogy, one which has a much longer and more insidious history in its political affiliations. As national debates swirl over whether conservative America believes in science, I'm reminded of scientific racism, for example, which was instrumental in maintaining slavery, Jim Crow, and to a degree the current carceral state. And I'm reminded of the institutionalized homophobia of medicine and psychiatry as lesbian, gay, and transgender activists struggled against the presumption of deviant pathological sexuality, especially in the case of the AIDS crisis. So in a sense, this is my first premise, that we can't take the politics of science for granted. Sciences are not naive, and we should be wary of their authority as the basis of our politics. The ACT UP movement in particular was a political movement about science, as historian Steve Epstein has shown, and science activism has a long history of demanding research that is capable of confronting the life and death stakes of contemporary politics. So far from trusting blindly in a neutral authoritative science, I want to argue that climate politics needs to learn how to act up. Brings me to my second premise, namely that silence is now the official policy of the federal and many state governments, and we know all too well that silence equals death. When I look at U.S. environmental politics, While there's much to be commended, I'm often amazed at how much we emphasize the shrill language of crisis and panic on the one hand, and the abstract legitimacy of science on the other, at the expense of celebrating what really matters to us and what should matter to a much broader coalition of American political society. As Candace Callison has shown, the facts alone are not an adequate basis for a cultural and political change that climate change requires. It must be linked up to a powerful cultural affirmation. Following the passage in North Carolina of the Transgender Bathroom Bill, businesses representing hundreds of millions of dollars pulled out of the state. I want to know why mainstream corporations aren't roaring in protest in the wake of Hurricane Harvey because the city of Houston and the state of Texas don't take climate change seriously. We've heard a lot about Trump's war on science. Thank you, Suzanne, for the terrifying and apt rundown. And there's obviously been a tremendous outpouring of concern, especially regarding environmental sciences, ranging from the Washington, D.C. March for Science and People's Climate March, and to the Environmental Data Rescue and guerrilla archiving efforts here at NYU, which is co-sponsored by Gallatin. Staffing levels at the EPA are now at a 30-year low. 1,100 staffers and scientists have departed under Pruitt's leadership. Without trying to catalog the abuses of the Trump administration, I do want to characterize some of their dirty tricks because it's at the level of technique that the strategy of silence and disruption shows their true colors. One key trick is an informal, unwritten policy of scrubbing the words climate change or global warming from government discourse and research, including grant-funded research by academics. This approach was pioneered by Rick Scott, governor of Florida, who found it to be an effective way to have a partial and ad hoc response to climate impacts in Florida without needing to sacrifice any political ground. There are other important precedents, however, such as the gag order on doctors' ability to discuss abortion with patients, or the inability to fund research on gun violence as a public health issue. If you understand that climate change is a public health issue, which is in fact a legal basis for regulating carbon emissions in the U.S., then you can quickly see how scrubbing the term climate change from health research will serve to isolate atmospheric sciences from the much broader, more intimate space of our health concerns. Another important tactic is to engage in spirited red team, blue team debates about poor climate science, essentially pitting bona fide climate scientists against a small coterie of industry-funded denialists who trot out the same talking points, no matter how many times they've been refuted. Pruitt has promised this as an essential part of the EPA's science process, but the trick comes at least in part from James Inhofe, senator from Oklahoma and Pruitt's buddy, who's made great use of lampooning scientific testimony as the Senate inquiries. By putting scientists on the spot and forcing them to debate absurdities, the strategy legitimates false claims about climate change. But more importantly, it gives denialists fodder for cherry-picking real scientists' testimony in denialist PR soundbites. Many science advocates, as anthropologist Candace Callison shows, have been deeply disillusioned by the official nonsense their words have been used to support. States like Oklahoma, Florida, and Texas are on the front lines of climate change in the United States, both as culprits and as victims. And what we are witnessing at the federal level has been pioneered by deeply conservative state governments, which brings me to Texas, and the explicit rejection of climate change as a factor for disaster planning along the Gulf and as a factor for urban development. Reporting by ProPublica and the Texas Tribune on this has been excellent. Mike Talbot, 18-year head of the Harris County Flood Control Agency, claims that large storms are freak occurrences, and quote, the Flood Control District has no plans to study climate change or its impacts in Harris County, third most populous county in the United States. Now these same power brokers have the gall to say linking Hurricane Harvey to climate change is insensitive. Anti-AIDS activism and climate change activism are at best partially or incompletely analogous, and I'm not suggesting that they're directly comparable. But on the other hand, viewed through the lens of cultural politics, I think there are some important, in fact, literal connections. AIDS, of course, was talked about as a manifestation of God's wrath and punishment for the sins of homosexuality. In fact, extreme weather has always played a profound symbolic role in the Protestant imagination of God's power. Hurricane Sandy was claimed by some evangelicals to be punishment for Gotham's sins. The connection between weather and God's grace is very old in American Protestantism. I say this as an anthropologist, but not as an expert on anything related to American religion. If you look at the famous 1741 sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, the weather is frequently heralding divine punishment. Men are saved at God's pleasure, and God's pleasure alone, he preached. The floods of God's vengeance have been withheld, he wrote. But your guilt in the meantime is constantly increasing, and you are every day treasuring up more wrath. The waters are continually rising, waxing more and more mighty, and there is nothing but the mere pleasure of God that holds the waters back. Flood and pestilence share a common cause in God's will, and anti-AIDS activists understood the violence of the pestilence metaphor intimately. Is the flood metaphor that different? We underestimate the power of these connections that are in peril, referring in contrast to trust in data and numbers. Actually, if you believe that you are among the saved, if you believe that you're among the saved by virtue of God's grace alone, and you experience extreme weather as a visceral manifestation of God's power, then climate change as a secular thesis runs up against the same ideological battleground as abortion and evolution. Here I think we need to emphasize the complexities of U.S. society, figure out who our friends are, and find a way to engage in wedge politics. After all, many religious people, including evangelicals, care deeply about protecting God's creation, but there's almost no mainstream climate activism that acknowledges that. Don't get me wrong, there's very much good environmental activism and organizing, but what I wish for is something more celebratory of a vision of affirmation, something more visceral and intimate, less focused on the numbers or on the vision of an abstract globalism, or by contrast, shrill portrayals of victimhood. We need to talk about what and who we love. Anti-AIDS politics is visceral and embodied. It is deeply affirmative of queer lifestyles and was an important part of normalizing those lives in the lives of many Americans, even if that remains troublingly incomplete. ACT UP was also unrelenting in identifying institutional enemies and skewering bureaucrats and politicians alike for their inaction. Above all, anti-AIDS activism directly confronted the ability of an ostracized and embattled group of people to live and thrive. It was expressly and provocatively the biopolitics, suspicious of the authority of mainstream sciences, which were being used against them, but knowing intimately that medicine and science should and could be on their side. Climate justice and indigenous environmental movements are important exceptions to my point, and I want to close with a brief discussion here. In particular, part of the need is to break out of a comfortable form of identity politics that would assimilate LGBTQ rights, indigenous sovereignty, black liberation within a kind of stable liberal multiculturalism. Identity politics has received a lot of flack recently, but it's crucial to remember that much contemporary identity politics arose not within the rhetoric of assimilation, but as an uncomfortable assertion of vital matters of life and death. This could return us to an affirmation of environmental justice at the core, not the periphery of environmentalism. As Beth Povinelli reminds us, indigenous environmental politics shouldn't be viewed through the lens of multicultural tolerance, but rather it's much closer to the rallying cry of Black Lives Matter. It's much closer to the rallying cry of Black Lives Matters, I can't breathe. We can do a lot more to drive home these vital stakes in the public debates about climate change. Thank you.
I'm going to jump to Alice. And then come back to Alejandro. Hopefully that will be taken care of. All right. Dr. Allison Heslin, Climate Change, Migration, and Cultural Preservation.
Hi everyone, my name is Allison Heslin. I work at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, which is a climate change research institute in Vienna, Austria. I used to be faculty here up until last spring. So what I do and what YASA does is these sort of large-scale climate models for various consequences of climate change under different scenarios. So what you read about, what will happen to crop yield in a world that is 2 degrees warmer versus 4 degrees warmer versus 6 degrees warmer. These sort of like large-scale climate models are generally coming out of EASA. That's the type of research that we do. And my project there is using these predictions, using these models of what's going to happen to understand how that's going to affect food security, how it's going to affect migration, and how it's going to affect conflict in the next 50 to 100 years. So that's my main focus. That's the main focus of the institute that I work at. But today, I thought I would talk briefly about a secondary interest, sort of pet project that I have, which is trying to use my research and my interests to inform what is called the loss and damage debate. And so the loss and damage debate is going around in policy circles, to some extent in academics as well. And the main focus of loss and damage is determining what we will not be able to adapt to, what's either too late or too costly and is just going to happen. So there's been a slight shift in focus for some people who are studying climate change. So instead of focusing all of our energy on what we can do to prevent climate change, mitigate climate change by changing our energy sources or consumption patterns, etc. What are we going to do now that this is absolutely happening? Who's going to lose the most? In what way? How do we manage that? And the main focus of the loss and damage debate centers around economic losses. So essentially, what often the conversation is that I witness or am engaged in is this sort of calculation of which adaptations are more costly than we stand to lose economically by not adapting. So where is saving a place or saving an industry more expensive than it's economically worth, so we just write it off as a loss? And that is, it's clean, quantifiable, measurable, works great for the conversations, but it is sort of horrific at the same time, because we're not always talking about should we continue to invest in this particular type of power plant. We're talking about should we continue to build seawalls around a community? Or is it going to be too expensive to maintain that, so we write off this entire area where people live? And that is messier, right? How do you measure, how do you say it's going to cost this much to lose the culture of a space? It's not measured in dollars as easily or at all, so it doesn't enter into the sort of policy conversations that I find myself in as often as I think it really should. So this is the part of my research that is just trying to continually throw culture and politics into the conversation when it is almost always just numbers of this is how much it would cost to build this versus this is how much we'll lose in the economy if we don't do it. So one topic that I think this lends itself to very well is migration. So the non-economic losses that happen with displacement, I think are really important to take into account, not just how much is it going to cost to move everybody, what's it going to do to the economy where they left versus the economy they arrived to, but what else is happening here? What are the losses and damages that are not economic? So climate change migration is being studied quite a bit now, and it's somewhat unclear the exact ways that it'll affect and where it will affect, mainly because it happens through a lot of different avenues. The one that's very clear and easy to measure, and everyone would sort of think of it is sea level rise, particularly for coastal communities or small islands, low-lying islands. And that one is much more straightforward. You can measure, in this year with this much sea level rise, these handful of islands will no longer exist. But it also happens through natural disasters. It happens through land degradation, and these are much harder to measure. When do people move from agriculture to cities? Is it because of climate change? Is it because they're seeking different opportunities? Are they pushed off the land for some other reason? So it kind of gets muddied a little bit. But we would expect it to happen in certain regions of the world, depending on the effects on agriculture. And then lastly, land conflict. So I was at a presentation the other day of one of my colleagues who studies traditional livelihoods in Finland, and they're building wind turbines, but that's displacing the reindeer herders who occupy 30% of Finnish land. So we are adapting to climate change in a good way, but there are still consequences on the population and pushing people off the land as well. So the challenges of climate migration, the economic ones are clear. They're talked about quite often. And as likely everyone knows, when we talk about migration and we talk about migrants, it tends to always fall back to economics in a very problematic way. So even people arguing in favor of immigration, be it climate or not, generally use the arguments of, well, immigrants contribute to the economy. They take jobs that Americans wouldn't want, blah, blah, blah. So their value is measured in terms of their economic input. And then the arguments against immigration, similar sort of economic focus. So you have, what do they cost social services? What jobs do new migrants take that could have gone to native-born populations, et cetera? So that's what I'm trying to kind of push the conversation away from, or at least add to that conversation as much as I can. So if we want to really understand what's lost when people are displaced due to climate change, we also have to take into account the political and cultural losses of that displacement. So where are people going to resettle? How will that be determined? Will they have political representation in this new space if they're migrating across borders? Will they be able to continue cultural or religious practices? Will they have a community or social support where they arrive? These sort of questions I think are really important, but they're generally not being asked in this loss and damage conversation. So what I have looked at is the Marshall Islands as sort of a small case study to add to this conversation. Because I've lived in the Marshall Islands, and I've interviewed quite a few people who have moved from the Marshall Islands to the United States to try to just get a basic outline of what are some of the non-economic challenges that exist and how are we going to be able to deal with this given that it is going to happen. The Marshall Islands exist at the highest 2 meters above sea level. And it's not even that the ocean has to rise 2 meters for that to be a problem, right? The main issue is that with small increases, the fresh water in the ground becomes salty and everyone has to move because there's no more water. So it's not that they'll be completely underwater within the next 50 years, but likely there will be a mass migration. Still small, the population is quite small, so it's not going to be so many people, 50,000, but that's the entire population of a country. Their language, their culture, their practices, gone, even though the number seems quite small when you look at these Pacific Island states. So on the political side, just as an example, and this, in some ways can be transferable to other climate displaced people, in some ways it might not be. So on the political side, in general, the idea, if people, are they being displaced internally or internationally? In both cases, where do they go? Especially internationally, in the event that we have entire countries needing to relocate this small island, developing states, what country do they go to? Which countries are accepting these climate refugees, as they will be? So in the case of the Marshall Islands, it's kind of a special case. Marshalese can travel freely and work in the United States without visas. So that is the obvious destination, currently the obvious destinations where a third of Marshallese citizens live in the United States at the moment. But they still face issues because they are not US citizens. So they're not eligible for social services, they can't use Medicaid, they can't vote. Yet they are subject to changes in the agreement that exists within the US and the Marshall Islands, which allows that free movement. And should that end, which it very well could because there's such an influx of people, what happens then? And then on the cultural side, displacement results in some unavoidable losses and some avoidable losses, which is kind of some more of the language that's used within this loss and damage debate. What could we potentially avoid or at least make slightly less bad, and what is just going to happen? And there's not really much that we can do about it. So the unavoidable losses is particularly losing these significant, meaningful places, which might be historic, religious places, or in the case of the Marshall Islands, which everyone talks about, is the landscape. So most people who move from the Marshall Islands to the US end up in Arkansas, which is kind of a bizarre destination, which started with a small group who moved there for low skill, low wage jobs, and a low cost of living, much lower than Honolulu, which might seem like the obvious destination coming from the Pacific Islands. And when you move from the Marshall Islands, which is this tropical paradise, to Arkansas, there are things that are just automatically gone, that aren't just, yes, it's nice to look outside and see, the pristine Pacific beaches, but there are historical skills and practices that are tied to being an island culture. So this ocean navigating and spearfishing, which are really, really integral for Marshallese culture, cannot really exist in Springdale, Arkansas, where everyone currently is living, or a very large portion of the Marshallese diaspora is living. But on a slight positive, through interviews trying to understand, what cultural practices can continue and what are the positive aspects of this migration, based on talking to people who have already done the move from the Marshall Islands to the United States. And then understanding which things are really important to them, what helps them maintain their culture that they had in the Marshall Islands, and then what can we do to foster those sorts of processes, expecting that more people are going to arrive from the Marshall Islands and from other Pacific Islands, other places. And one of that is the advantage of so many people from the Marshall Islands ending up in Arkansas is that they have a large, vibrant Marshallese community. And there's people who I wanted to interview, but they don't speak any English because they've been living there, but they only speak Marshallese, which is an incredibly small language in terms of the number of native speakers of it. And yet they can live in the United States and never have to learn English because they're so centered in their very large community, surrounded by Marshallese businesses and Marshallese community members going to Marshallese churches, etc. So they're still celebrating holidays and making their traditional foods and having a very strong community based in the United States. The problem with that is, as I'm sure everyone has heard, you generally have a sort of pushback when you have 50,000 people who arrive in a space and do not integrate with the communities that they arrive in. So I think it's important to remember, just to sort of close, that on the one hand, we stand to lose a lot more than money with these losses and damages from climate change, whether it be the locations themselves or the loss of culture from people having to move. But in anticipating that this is absolutely going to happen, in addition to continuing to fight to mitigate climate change as much as possible, we need to be a little bit realistic about what is actually already set. And in the event that we do end up receiving people from elsewhere to be much better hosts for displaced populations than generally people are, and keep in mind that in being good host communities, we need to accept the fact that the people who are displaced are generally people who have contributed to the problem substantially less than everyone sitting in this room, and especially the receiving countries entirely. Yeah, I'll end at that, but then we can get up to the conversation.
Unfortunately, we will not be able to hear Alejandro today, so I'm sure there are many questions for our panelists.
Question for the presentation that just passed. So, as far as when a population is displaced from an island and then they're settling somewhere else, what do you feel is the longevity of those traditions being passed on after generations? Because I hear a lot about how the younger generation might not learn. Older folks who keep that happening and it quickly changes.
Yeah, I think that's a very genuine concern. And I think it very much depends on what the situation is where they arrive. So when I was living in the Marshall Islands, there was this sort of conversation about what's going to happen. And that's, everyone's talking about that there. Where are we going to go? What's going to happen? How do we prepare for this? And the idea was somewhat tossed around within Marshallese politics of a sort of state within a state sort of system with the reservations. That could we have the Marshallese population living in the United States, but politically autonomous within some specified territory. I don't think that would guarantee the preservation of Marshallese culture by any stretch, but I think it would definitely impact the future of the Marshallese community based on what the system is where they end up. Or are they kind of scattered? This city will take X amount of people in this city. The way you see with refugees often, which countries are taking how many, which cities are taking how many, because you have members of the communities who don't want a massive influx of refugees. So it's like, oh, we'll scatter them, decrease the load on social services, but that's kind of detrimental to the community ties when you do that. I don't have an answer, but I think you're absolutely right in that question that the sorts of preservation that's happening may slowly decrease, though the beginning of Marshall Islanders being displaced was the U.S. Nuclear test that took place in the Marshall Islands in the 60s and 70s. So it's not like they've all just arrived, right? We have 2 to 3 generations worth of people living in the United States who have maintained their ties to each other and their language quite well up until this point.
I have a question for anybody, but maybe Jerome especially. I was a member of ACT UP, and I appreciate your discussing ACT UP as a model for activism, a successful model for activism. And I was also one of the founders of Occupy Sandy, and we were great, short term, but not as an enduring organization. What are the organizations today around climate change that any of you can recommend, or anyone in the audience that are making impactful change that anyone in this room can get involved with tomorrow or tonight?
Well, I have, to back up just briefly, I recently moved back to the United States it was last November, on November 8th, in fact. And was out of the country for almost 6 years. So part of what you're hearing today is me grappling with what it means to do environmental politics in the United States, where I wasn't, prior to this year. So, but organizations that I follow, well, I think the movement to target fossil fuel infrastructure is really important. The anti-pipeline movement, a lot of that came out of the failure of the 2009 Copenhagen Agreement. There was so much focus on carbon markets, on sort of blue sky environmentalism that was very corporate, and a lot of more critical activists, including climate justice activists, were in a sense biting their tongues because they felt that was, sort of the best that they could argue for something like a carbon tax. But people became a lot more serious after the failure of Copenhagen and started to really insist that we have to keep fossil fuels in the ground if we have a kind of chance. And so I think the no doubt protests are really significant. We see their limitations. So I've been impressed with that. I think, personally, I think 350.org actually does a good job. Although, there's many other things that they could be doing as well. I think in general, looking at how environmental justice groups are engaging with climate change is really important. There is also, at a more mainstream level, groups like 314 Action, which is trying to get scientists involved in policy making more. They're interesting work for sure.
I saw someone immediately raise their hand over here. Do you want to answer?
There's something called the New York City Grassroots Alliance, which is a group of groups, and they meet monthly. And that's sort of a good way to get to see what all the different groups are doing.
Do they have a website or a Facebook?
Yeah, they have a,
Do you know how to get?
yes, yeah, a meetup group, meetup page. Also, I actually wanted to make a comment about this. There's also something which I'm obsessed with, is Derek Jensen, deep green, okay, my brain isn't working, but he basically tries to talk about the preservation of nature. And I just want to bring up, I'm always feeling terrible that everybody's focusing, they say that renewable energy is a panacea. And there's so little discussion about that. We really need to conserve and use less. And nobody wants to focus on that part. And I really feel like everything is going to be unsuccessful that we're doing unless we address this. If we keep building new buildings and growing and growing and growing and using more, we're never going to be able to address any of these problems. But he addresses it, and he's also like the best writer ever. If you do a search for Derek Jensen in Orion, which is a very nice publication, it will really blow you away.
I can just comment on that a little bit, because I totally agree that the emphasis, especially by the 2000s, shifted very powerfully to environmental solutions that didn't make any demands on consumers in the Euro-American context. And that was an explicit shift among environmental groups, especially big green environmental groups. Things like carbon markets were essential to that. So a lot of the big green groups got heavily involved with big finance actors because they believed that only having the power of a major commercial lobby behind their agenda did they stand a chance of addressing the fossil fuel issue. So it was a bit of a Faustian bargain, and it didn't actually pay off in the end, but we're still dealing with that.
Just a couple questions here.
Thank you. I think this speaks probably to everyone, but Jacob stepped out, so you can catch him up later. I'm wondering, thinking about your comments, especially Allison, these anti-pipeline protests that are led by primarily indigenous groups, because these are concerns that will overwhelmingly impact reserve land and reserve water sources. I think, these climate justice initiatives that are led by indigenous people are part and parcel of broader movements for indigenous autonomy, and I can think of organizations like the Red Nation, who are simultaneously also protesting police killings of homeless indigenous people in the Southwest, and this is linked up with the anti-pipeline protests in the Dakotas, and so on and so forth. So how do we reconcile, and I do think everyone spoke to this to some extent, how do we reconcile that a lot of these climate justice initiatives are not, at this moment, I would argue, well tied in the mainstream imagination to movements for racial justice generally. So we're not talking about settler colonialism in the United States in relationship to, let's say, the future of climate refugees to the United States, although we clearly haven't made ourselves very welcoming in that regard. So how do we build these links, I think, that were discussed earlier in a more proactive way that is intimately, related to questions of racism and racial justice?
I guess I can start on that one. I think that's a really, really excellent point, and it does kind of build on the prior comment of, what is very comfortable for people to involve themselves in, and what sort of movements or organizations are easier, that don't make you question, well, on the one hand, your consumption, but more than that, getting to your point, your privilege and your situation and your place within the power structure, and how these are all very, very much tied together. And it's much easier to say, okay, I'll select for the carbon offset on my flight, rather than engage with the extent that the environmental damages are also very, very much tied to racial capitalism. And I think you're very right in pointing out the importance of indigenous groups and indigenous organizations in fighting for environmental preservation and against the fossil fuel industry in a lot of places. And I think the environmental movements that are very much separate from that do so at a big detriment to the power of their movements and the potential power to actually change the whole structure, which is clearly what has to happen, right? So solving climate change within the current structure without really affecting anything, just swapping out power plant for a different type of power plant, and we all continue our lives exactly as they currently stand, is not really happening. How exactly we make that happen, I don't know that I have the answer to that, but I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
I think, I'll just say it loud. I don't have an answer, but I think that the question you raise is the fundamental question, because climate change, as someone in the audience said, as you said, is primarily not a technical challenge. It's primarily a political challenge, and it's a political challenge that is only going to be solved politically, which will fundamentally have to deal with settler colonialism and capitalism. And that if we attempt to treat climate change as something that we can engineer our way out of, I actually just think it's going to fail, right? Like that it's just not going to work. And so then the question has to be not, yes, climate change overlays it, but then the question is just the same questions that we've been asking for however long about how do we decolonize and how do we end capitalism, and climate change will be a nice bonus to doing it.
I would just caution about making capitalism and settler colonialism into too much of a monolith. I think one of the lessons of looking at activist practices that have been really effective is that they were able to break apart things that we thought were really solid systems. This is true for effective environmentalism, it's true for feminism, it's true for queer rights, it's true for a lot of things. To me, when I look around at the most exciting activism that's happening, it's movements like Black Lives Matter, which is impatient, right? It's not going to wait for us to get the theory right, in a sense. And it's moving towards, certainly its values are, definitely targeting, these very big hegemonic historical formations. But their way of thinking about it doesn't turn them into monoliths, but rather tries to engage tactically in ways to break these things up and lets us get to work now, rather than expecting the system to fall. We're not going to overthrow capitalism in time to fix climate change.
Hi, for Allison, when you were talking about the 50,000 Marshall Islanders have moved to, was it Arkansas? And then you said that there has been some kind of pushback by people there, since a lot of the Marshall Islanders are staying within their community and speaking their own language exclusively. Would you care to mention at all what kind of pushback has been happening, and has there been any kind of dialogue consequently, between the different communities to get along better? Thank you.
Sure, so there's, well, a couple things. So the entire population of the Marshall Islands is 50,000. And about 20,000 more are living in the United States, of which maybe 6,000 or 7,000 live in Springdale. So large percentages, but not actually large in concrete numbers. But the comments about pushback from the community, there has been to some extent pushback in the community in Springdale. But the comment I made about that was more of a general observation of how cities or communities deal with an influx of migrants from a particular place, wherever. So it's not so much that in Springdale there was some, mass protest against the arrival of Marshallese, and I think partially because they came piecemeal, right? So there wasn't some mass disruption where all 7,000 arrived at the same time. One family member, then the rest of the family, then et cetera, et cetera. So in that way, it's probably slightly different than what would happen should everyone have to get up and move, in which case I think the reception would be somewhat different. And then in terms of the communities getting along, and that runs into the issue, right? Like, is complete integration the goal? And is that, what are we sacrificing at the expense? What does that actually mean? Is it integration? Is the American community there actually adopting any Marshallese cultural practices? It's not. It's the erasure of the Marshallese culture is what we would really...
Unless there's some special food or something that might become popular.
I suppose that's possible. We could all eat breadfruit. But yeah, I think it's we should be slightly cautious when talking about the integration into the existing community. What does that really mean? Should that even be the goal?
So we have time for about 2 more questions. We have one here, I saw one here. Panelists will be here, so if you want to ask more questions.
I would like to continue the same discussion we just started, and I think when you see the refugee and migration moves crossing the East and into Europe, you see very strongly what kind of pushback there is, especially when migrants come from a different culture, have a different religious background, and when there is some violence, so the population gets stirred up, and unless what you said, like global solidarity, the opposite is happening, and people sort of calcify into old borders, and right-wing populism uses that for their politics, so the chances for solidarity don't look that great. And I would even go that far to say that the problems in Syria are partially climate change related, because they have a big drought, they didn't have an appropriate government response, they have a lot of angry young men, which is a right picking for terrorism, and that brings up the whole security issue, because maybe the Marshallese will move peacefully, but not everybody will move peacefully and will search for a culprit and then act accordingly. So that to me is something that I think is a very big danger of climate change, social disruption.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and you see that, you especially see that in Austria, where I live, the rise of right-wing populist movements in response to an influx of refugees, Syrian refugees. I worry about placing, well, I think it matters who the refugees are, right? But I don't think it matters what the refugees are doing. I think it falls a lot more in the historic racism of a space of who gets accepted into that country or who does not, rather than the fact that they're fleeing war versus fleeing a flood or fleeing a hurricane, right? Who gets accepted versus not can't really fall to the behavior of the refugees before they've even arrived in a space. Sort of anticipating their violence has a lot more to do with the existing prejudices within the space that they would end up.
So, being an engineer, I have a more general question to, well, nobody in particular. Don't you think, or can you agree that the main thing is that we want to fight climate change? So don't you think that by overburdening this mission with while all other things like sexual equality, indigenous populations, saving this and saving that, don't you think we will not reach average Joe? Because I suppose the most important thing is that people will have to change their behavior. Apart from any technical solution, we have to change how we live, how we consume, and if you want to reach average Joe, then you need to make it clear to him that the problem is going to be that there's no irrigation for his golf course. But he's not caring about any indigenous people somewhere. So the Green Movement in Germany, which probably is one of the most successful in the world, only was successful when they were focusing on like clear messages, like we want to stop acid rain, we want to preserve the wood which is dying. Then people had a broad support. But the moment you brought in like particular things, which are all very noble and important, but the moment they lost focus, they also lost support. So my question is, shouldn't we focus on the thing which is fighting climate change and not overburdening it with other very noble tasks and causes?
Maybe I'll just speak to that a little bit, because it reminds me a little bit of the way that, it reminds me of a little bit about some of the debates around globalization, which I was talking about. And I think that, one of the interesting, I think, it was interesting, really interesting to hear you talk about ACT UP and to hear about Occupy Sandy and so on. I think one of the really important political mobilizations in that moment of shift, I think from globalization to climate change as a kind of meta concept, was the anti-globalization movement, right? In the late 90s, early 2000s and so on, right? And that movement aimed large, Davos, et cetera, and it aimed small, like using something like the World Social Forum to bring in communities of people who felt like they were not at the table in the conversation about globalization, right? And those kinds of struggles, I think, about the question of democracy in relationship to how the politics and the economy and the culture of globalization is being bandied about, thought about, planned for, institutionalized, rolled out, I think actually became a huge kind of problem for the powers that be that were defining globalization. And so, I think the ways in which some anthropologists started talking about scale, started talking about context, started talking about locality, is a way of saying that there is no way out but through, right? In the sense that we are entangled, embodied beings, right? And I think the way that a certain discourse about globalization rolled itself out is a classic example of a kind of macro view with a kind of monolithic understanding of what's happening that doesn't engage issues of scale, locality, etc. And I would hope that that's one thing that comes out of the globalization, anti-globalization conversation that might inform some of the ways in which people think about climate change.
Unfortunately, we have to end. Thank you to this wonderful panel. Maybe they'll be here to stick around if you have more questions. We have another panel at 11:15, Climate and the Imagination.
Write a recap or something Star Trek.
think what we see is planning very nice. There's a lot.